who's going to get the next segment of the evening.
Good evening and peace. Once again, welcome and thank you for gathering together this evening. I am Maria Surratt of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. A word of thanks to Bishop John Michael and Brother Sorsha for the invitation to be part of tonight's program. Thanks also to everyone who had a role in making this evening possible. To the community of San Egidio for leading us in a prayer for peace. To Pax Christi Metro DC Baltimore for providing our supper. And to St. Vincent de Paul Parish and St. Vincent de Paul Justice and Peace Committee for offering this space for our gathering tonight. We'd like to welcome Martha Hennessy, granddaughter of the servant of God Dorothy Day, and Elizabeth Salmon, daughter of the World War I conscientious objector Ben Salmon. Special thanks to each of you for your presence here this evening, for your care for Christ's Church, and for your desire to discern how we might best embody his peace in the world today. We gather again this evening to consider together ways the Church is called to point to Jesus Christ, who is our peace. Last year's discussion was varied. What we've attempted to do tonight, and in the spirit of this year of mercy, is assemble a program that draws together many of the concerns raised last year and connect them to particular human stories for our shared consideration. Our program tonight will take up questions about how the Church is called to listen to, accompany, and minister to military, former military, and their loved ones in our midst. What truths, needs, and challenges do they present to us? Attending to those whose lives have been shaped by war, victims, and combatants has been an area of pastoral concern in the Church today and throughout history. I now ask Catholic Peace Fellowship Director Sean Storer to offer some words framing tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Maria. Last year, the bishops who gathered for the Church Synod on the vocation and mission of the family underscored the suffering of those whose lives and lives are destroyed by war and the deleterious effect war has on families, relationships, cultures, the land, and societies. In their synthesis of the Synod, bishops from around the world also called special attention to the consequences and wounds of war on those who have waged it and those related to them. The Synod Fathers said this: when returning from war, these men and women are often suffering from post-traumatic syndrome and are troubled in conscience, which poses serious moral questions for them, all of which require serious pastoral attention. Pope Francis has also called for special attention to the effects of war on human persons, the land, and communities. In an address to chaplains charged with the pastoral care for people who are or have been in militaries around the world, Pope Francis said this: war, in fact, disfigures bonds between brothers, between nations. It also disfigures those who are witnesses of such atrocities. Many military men return after war operations or missions for the reestablishment of peace with true and proper interior wounds. War can leave an indelible mark on them. In reality, war always leaves an indelible mark. I have heard at this time the stories of so many bishops who received in their diocese soldiers who left to engage in war, how they return with these wounds. The Holy Father reminds us, though, however, as Christians, we are profoundly convinced that the ultimate objective, that most worthy of the person and of the human community, is the abolition of war. Therefore, we must always be committed to build bridges that unite and not walls that separate. We must always help to seek the hope for mediation and reconciliation. We must never yield to the temptation to consider the other only as an enemy to destroy, but rather as a person gifted with intrinsic dignity. In the 4th century, the doctor of the Church, St. Augustine of Hippo, called for similar attention to the effects of war on human persons and communities. In The City of God, Augustine used the Latin term animi dolere, which is translated heartfelt grief, anguish of the soul, or sorrowful soul, to describe the tragedy and evils of war. St. Augustine urges, Let everyone, therefore, who reflects with pain upon such great evils, upon such horror and cruelty, acknowledge that this is misery. And if anyone either endures them or thinks of them without anguish of the soul, his condition is still more miserable, for he thinks himself happy only because he has lost all human feelings. We with the CPF regularly underscore that Augustine's words are not just for or about those who have participated in war or endured combat. They are for anyone who would even think of what transpires in war. One of CPF's early advisors, Dorothy Day, stressed that we must talk about poverty because people insulated by their own comfort lose sight of it. We with the CPF often say that this has become true of war as well in this land. And so we seek to cultivate spaces in which truth-telling and honest conversations about war can take place. We mourn that as a people in this country, and oftentimes as a church in this country, we seem to be very far away from the ancient Christian abhorrence of bloodshed that we would want to mark our common life. Such a reality points us in this historical moment to an urgent need for learning to listen attentively to those who have endured the great evils of war and movement together toward lament.
Thank you, Sean. Pope Francis has been encouraging us to cultivate a culture of encounter and dialogue in the church. We hope that tonight's gathering sparks further conversation, prayer, respectful discussion, and discernment about our call and responsibility as followers of our Lord Jesus Christ. Several years ago, I was drawn to the Catholic Peace Fellowship's personalist work for peace before, during, and after war, while I was a Master of Divinity student at Notre Dame. I chose CPF as my ministry field placement for 2 years. The practical and pastoral support CPF offered to military and veterans who are struggling with the contradiction between their personal participation in war and their consciences was part of what drew me there. It was during this time that I learned of the work of Dr. Warren Kinghorn, whom I am incredibly grateful to introduce to you tonight. I sought to study with Dr. Kinghorn last year to better serve in the CPF's David's Heart ministry to former military and their loved ones. We so appreciate his having traveled from Durham, North Carolina to be with us this evening and to speak with us. Dr. Kinghorn holds joint appointments within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences of Duke University Medical Center and the Duke Divinity School, where he teaches in moral and pastoral theology and is co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. He is also a staff psychiatrist and clinical teacher at the Durham VA Medical Center. Dr. Kinghorn's work as a medical practitioner and scholar centers on the role of religious communities in caring for persons with mental health problems and how Christians engage practices of modern health care. His current scholarly interests include the contributions of the theology and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas to contemporary debates about psychiatric diagnosis, psychiatric technology, and human flourishing, and the moral and theological dimensions of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Kinghorn is an elder at Blacknall Memorial Presbyterian Church in Durham, North Carolina. He and his wife, Susan, have 2 elementary school-aged children. Dr. Kinghorn will offer some prepared remarks this evening and will also guide us through testimonies by 3 young people that we have available by video. We will hear the words of 3 men who are raised in Christian households and enlisted to join the military for various reasons, ranging from responding to a sense of duty to looking for a way to pay for college education. In the first video, we will hear from former member of the Army, Camilo Mejia. In the second, from former Air Force drone pilot, Brandon Bryant. We will conclude with videos of the late Joshua Castile, an Army veteran whose mother, Christy, spoke at last year's dinner. These are but 3 particular voices. We chose these 3 people in part because organizers of the dinner have connected with each of them personally over the years through the CPF, other parts of the Catholic peacemaking community, or the Catholic worker. After the presentation, Raquel Falk, who shared the story of her journey from being a Naval Sea Cadet to becoming a Catholic worker at last year's Peace Dinner, will moderate questions for Dr. Kingborn as well as comments. Thank you again for being here, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Warren Kingborn.
Thank you to Maria and Sean, and to all of you, who have been active in organizing this evening and this dinner, and for all of you who are attending tonight. It's really an honor for me to be here, and I'm challenged and blessed by your witness and your faith, and I'm really quite humbled to be standing here. Thank you. I also see myself not as someone who is coming as an expert, but at best as someone who's helping to facilitate our viewing of the videos. I don't personally know any of the people that we'll be seeing, but I've also been challenged by their faith and their witness. And so I'm going to offer a few words as a way of introduction to these videos. Then we're going to watch two. I'll say a few things to lead into the others, and then we'll conclude with some reflections on how best to provide care for returning combat veterans in the light of the voice and the witness that we hear in these videos. So that's our plan for the next few minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for conversation, and that's what I see as actually the most important. Again, I'm very honored to be here. I want to be clear, I'm not myself a military veteran. My father is an Air Force veteran, but I grew up with a very generally remote relationship to the military. I had a grandfather also who was a World War II veteran. But as a psychiatry resident at Duke, after finishing medical school, I began to work at the VA hospital in Durham, North Carolina. And for me, that was the first time that I began to meet people who had very close, deep encounters with war. I met at that point World War II veterans, this was about 10 or 15 years ago, who had slept 4 hours a night since the 1940s and never had really told anybody that. And now in their 80s and 90s were being brought by their children and grandchildren for treatment. I met Vietnam veterans who'd never been able to keep a job for very long, who had been through multiple marriages, who struggled with substance use, and had never actually heard the word PTSD. And when they actually recognized that they weren't alone in those experiences, it was deeply freeing for them to notice that. And then after a few years, I began to meet returning veterans from Iraq and from Afghanistan, and to hear their stories, people who were very close to my own age, in some cases, in most cases, younger, and to begin to recognize how war changes people who fight it. So I stand here not as one who's experienced war, but as a witness to the voice of others, and as someone who can lead us into these conversations. I will say that as a psychiatrist, I know there's some nurses in the room. How many of you have some clinical training, medical training in the room? So a good number. When I first started to encounter combat veterans in the VA healthcare system, I learned to think about PTSD in one of two ways. One way was in a way that I now see as kind of patronizing. I would tell people, me as someone who's quite younger than these Vietnam veterans, would say, you've been through things that no human should ever have to go through, and now you've been trying to push them down for many years, and now they're beginning to come out in dreams or nightmares or unwanted memories. And I now recognize that that's a deeply faulty way to approach these veterans. I also learned that post-traumatic stress disorder was a disorder of fear. So I would say things like, you experienced things in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam that led you to be in some way afraid or anxious, and then that got generalized to other experiences. So you might have experienced an improvised explosive device blast in Iraq, and now you see trash on the side of the road on an interstate highway, and you swerve over, and that's an example of fear getting generalized. So we need to institute some treatments to help you reduce your level of fear and anxiety. That might be medications, or it might be certain kinds of therapy. But then I began to listen more closely to what people were actually saying to me when they were coming in for treatment. I also began to listen to friends who were veterans and to colleagues who were veterans. And they said some things, in some cases, that were very similar to what we'll hear on these two videos. So let's start hearing from Camila Mejia and Brandon Bryan.
When people ask me if I killed anybody, there's a lot of confusion because you see, words not as clear cut as they portray it in the movies. There was this one time we're positioned on this rooftop. It was like a political protest that turned violent. Everyone is quiet, and this young man emerges, and he's got something in his hand. And I know that it's a grenade, and but I also know that he can't do anything to us because he's too far. Everything that I'm describing to you, I'm looking through the rear aperture of my M16 sight. So it's a very, very, very intense moment. And I don't remember squeezing the trigger, and I don't remember seeing him go down. All I remember is that we shot at him, and that the next image that I have is, you know, two men came from the crowd and grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him through a puddle of blood. And then I remember that after that mission was over, you know, before we moved on to our next mission, you know, I went into a dark room by myself and I pulled out my magazine and I counted the bullets and I realized that I had fired 11 bullets at him. And